pain's a great substitute teacher. Like when pain comes into your life, you're just like, man, I'm learning. I don't want to learn these lessons. I didn't ask for it, but I'm learning. Jason, what God has done, like in his faithfulness and in his timing and his compassion and just the way that he's blessed my life and my family and my children. It's unbelievable. It's redemption. It's like I've got to walk a redemption path, and it's amazing.
Well, Andy, thanks for having us in your home.
It's great to have you here.
I don't think it's fair for me to say this because every part of Canada is beautiful, but spending time on Vancouver Island yesterday and today, like what an incredible place to live.
It's amazing, but don't tell anyone, okay? Well,
you don't want everyone finding out.
No, that's actually what Victoria...
Some people have made it to visit Vancouver, but they haven't taken the boat over to Vancouver Island and seen. It's just incredible.
It's amazing. If you come at the right time of the year, you'll get to hang out with some whales on your way over.
That's for Rach, my wife, and I, like the dream. Her biggest dream is just to see a pod of orcas. So we're hoping on the trip back today.
Okay,
we might get to see.
We'll just like pray for that.
Yeah, honestly, Rachel does pray for that.
With whales.
Like if you had a ministry at Coastline praying that people would see whales, she would show up for that.
Well, I think it's going to happen. I mean, like honestly, okay, when you get to Active Pass and you kind of cruise through those two little islands, keep looking. We'll
keep our eyes out. How long have you been in Victoria or on Vancouver Island?
I guess it's been about 24 years.
And before that, where were you?
I'm from Arizona.
Okay.
Yeah.
What brought you to Canada?
Well, that's a big question. It's actually kind of a loaded question. There are times where I give like one of two answers. Okay. I say, opportunity brought me here. But if I tell the real story, it's like people go like, oh gosh, that's more than I wanted to know. So I'll ask you, which version do you want?
Well, because of my intrigue, I want the involved version.
Okay. Well, it starts with the fact that I was married before.
Yeah.
And I was married to a woman that I met in Bible college in Arizona. And she was from Victoria. And so we lived and did ministry in Arizona. And then at a certain time, we had sort of a marital collapse. And there was unfaithfulness on the part of my spouse. And we together decided we were going to try to put that relationship back together.
Wow.
And so the best way that I knew how would be to say, let's go be close to your family. Great people, very supportive, love God, love us. Let's go and see if that will help. So that's how I immigrated from the United States to Canada. Wow. Yeah.
That's so, thanks for sharing that, by the way.
Yeah, sure.
I'm glad you didn't take the shorter version. It's so profound because I have just experienced your life on the other side of that. I've known you for probably over 10 years now. And I experience so much gratitude for the story that God has written through your life and through your family's life here in Canada and on Vancouver Island. And it strikes me how about the kindness and redemptive power of the Lord to take a move that came out of real brokenness and like a hands open attempt to see, if I hear you right, restoration there, and how God's weaved a story that you would have never written.
No, I mean, and how can you see it coming?
Yeah.
Right. Like it's not what you do. I think we're pastors. And so when you think of pastoral ministry and you think of what you're dreaming for, no one anticipates that kind of fallout or that kind of rebuild. I totally, we would preach and believe that God is a redemptive God, but then when you're left with some broken pieces and you're trying to hold them together and figure out how they fit back together, sometimes it can feel pretty hopeless, but I'm certainly convinced that there are redemptive paths. And so that was the attempt, right? And coming to Canada and kind of creating a new space and And
so when you came, did you jump into a role at Coastline?
No, when I first came to Canada, I worked with Youth for Christ, Youth Unlimited.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, for about a year and a half.
Oh, I love their work so much.
Yeah.
What was the expression of that for you guys here?
So I was the executive director.
Wow.
when it came to Victoria, there was an opening in that role, and I actually was invited while still in the States to consider the role. And so I came up, interviewed, and took the role. And that was great. Really great people on the team here in Victoria. That was a long time ago. But I think for me, what I discovered is after about a year and a half, I was like, man, I'm really enjoying working with people who work with youth, but I'm not done working with youth. There was still this heart to kind of build into youth directly versus be the guy who raises the funds and communicates widely about the work. And so that's when I connected with Ron, who was the lead pastor at Coastline. At the time it was called Glad Tidings.
Do you know that Ron's nephew, if I understand it right, is on the pastorate staff now?
Oh, okay.
Is that right? Do I have it right? It's nephew?
Yeah.
That would be Jordan.
Yeah, is that Jordan? Yeah. That's his nephew, exactly. And his grandson's actually on my staff now.
Really?
One of our youth, staff. Yeah.
So you came to work with Ron and you were in a youth pastor role.
Yeah. I started in youth ministry, kind of youth, young adults. And I could always, maybe there's some youth pastors out there that can relate to this. If you have that slash portfolio, I could always get one thing working. It was really hard to get them both.
So it was youth and what?
Young adults.
Yeah. It's like the tough one I always think is the youth worship leaders facility. That when someone has that role, that's tough.
That's a big
tough.
one. Yeah. So I just always felt like, I was getting one firing and not the other. And we had like seasons where I would like bring some youth up and then they'd become young adults, and then young adults was strong and youth was suffering. And so eventually we kind of, made the staff a little more robust and found our way. But I really found my space to just really thrive with young adults. Kind of, in the next, I guess it was 12 years that I served Ron.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tell me about that shift from a parachurch type expression to life in the local church. And I think that for some people, it's like I'm called to minister, and that can have so many expressions. Whether it's in the parachurch or nonprofit or local church. And it's kind of like, put me anywhere. But then sometimes for some, it's like I must be serving in the context of a local church, or there's that real pull. Was that just like, hey, working with youth here, or was there part of you going, I think I want to like plug deeply into the life of local church?
Yeah, I think the vision for Youth for Christ, especially at that stage, was to support the local church. Yeah. And so there was this sense of like truly walking beside the church. How can we serve the church? How can we get youth pastors on campuses? Because we had this whole campus life thing going. How can we make those, the loop kind of circle back to the local church? And with that heart, that allowed me the space that I felt that I needed in order to continue to engage with what we would call parachurch. But it wasn't long till I just felt that real longing for like deep community connection, felt like real fellowship with like a local body that I was invested in and investing in. And then just the way that I wanted to walk with students, maybe I could have transitioned to a different kind of role in the organization, but from where I was sitting, the job that I had to do, it meant that I was a little bit removed, and that was tough on me. So honestly, when I stepped back into local church ministry, I was like, for me, it was like, this is it.
Wow.
This is it. And I honestly not sure that I would ever work again outside the local church. I mean, if God directs or leads,
of course.
But boy, what a wonderful journey. What a wonderful place. And like, I'm just a church guy. I love the local church. Yeah.
How, you're now in this like most senior leadership role at Coastline, and that comes with so much organizational responsibility, from governance to finance to leading of staff. And how do you find the tension of that longing to do that frontline work? Because sometimes even like, I think lead pastors can feel like what you felt in that role, Youth for Christ, being like, I'm overseeing people who are doing that work.
Oh, gotcha.
And do you experience any of that?
That's a cool question for me to answer because of what I feel like has happened to me over the last, I would say probably 7-8 years. There's been a real shift inside of me. Like The ambitions have all changed. And so like, I would say that in my late 30s, early 40s, it was really about like, have I done enough? Have I accomplished what it was or is that I feel brings significance to my life? And then when I was about, I'd say maybe 42, 43, I'm 50 now. When I was about 42, 43, I realized the answer is yes. Like whatever it was that I felt that I needed to accomplish, I'm really happy with where I am. And I consider that just a real grace from God. You know, it's like how David says when he looked over the kingdom, he said, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I just had that sense in my own heart that's like, whatever it was that I thought I needed to accomplish, Lord, if there's something on the other side of that boundary line, I'm happy with where the boundary line is. I'm just satisfied in it. And so that became revolutionary for me, because what was on the other side of that was all of the coaching, all of the encouraging, all of the positioning of younger leaders into roles. So it was sort of like, I don't want anything else on my resume. I'm not looking for any other accolade. There's no ambition to climb anywhere else. I would joyfully serve here. And honestly, over years, see my role diminish. If that means that I can be a catalytic leader, holding open the door for people who it's their time now. It's their time to grow. It's their time to shine. And I feel a special burden about that, obviously for next generation leaders, but also for immigrants. Like, I feel like, and I mean this with all sincerity, if I can use my white face and my English voice to open the door for whom it is that God has sent us to bring revival in our nation, to speak truth to a generation with a fresh voice, maybe even with an accent that gives them permission in ways that, my Canadian way wouldn't. God, use me. Use me. So I kind of, okay, so I would use the term, I'm a gatekeeper, but sometimes people use that in the wrong way. Like I'm the guy who's keeping people out. I don't feel, I'm like the guy who's like letting people in. If I have any influence, if I have any platform, okay, let me open a door. Come on. So I think for me now, like the joy hasn't diminished. It's just the goalpost changed.
You've, one thing I wanted to honor about you, celebrate in our conversation today was the people export of Coastline Church. There's a great couple near us in Vancouver, Jordan and Amy Baker, who came from you guys. Worship leader at our church was raised up in large part with you guys. I was in Winnipeg recently, and Adam Brout was on the podcast recently, and he's there at Calvary Temple. Is it, they still call it that? Yeah, I love that, Calvary Temple. There was an era of church naming that I wish I belonged to, but that's another conversation. Lucas Bonnet and others, and he's in Saskatoon. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And what a sweet thing for you at only 50, because that's young, to have been able to see such good people, men and women, from Amy to Lucas to others, spend time with you, get opportunity at Coastline, and then be sent. And I really just want to honor that about you.
Oh, thank you.
And it's a grace on your life. It's a grace on the fact that the church is a multi-staff church, because not every church has the same ability to do that through staffing models, though you can always do it through lay models. But I feel like great joy going, wow, look how God has set up. Because I think for the future of the church in Canada, we need, because we have a leadership crisis, a shortage of called, equipped, courageous pastors, men and women saying yes to leading local churches. So churches need to have a surplus of leaders raised up. We need to assume that the feeling is we send two, we keep one, or whatever. I don't know. It's like, I don't want to sound like it's like a assembly line. That sounds people are not like that, but we need to have a surplus of called, developed, released leaders. So we need to receive well and send very well. And I actually think that the church historically always understood her identity as a sending body. Like we exist because the church in Jerusalem sent. And throughout church history, like whether it's the Moravians or whoever it is, this sending impulse of both missionaries, but also developed, cultivated leaders. But somehow, I don't know where it is that impulse has become harder to find in the Canadian landscape, where the default assumption is we're going to disproportionately invest and we might not see the full fruit of that investment on our tree or whatever the metaphor is.
Totally. And I think that is in some ways what creates that freedom for God to say, I'll bless that.
Yeah.
To be like, okay, God, I don't control where the fruit lands. I'll just be a part of, cultivating the roots and watering the tree, and then you spread it where you want. And that's hard because I also have some dreams for Vancouver Island. I also have some
and sometimes it feels like things are just starting to like, because we always feel a little bit below the water line of local church, and you finally get team leaders are like developed. You're like, things are covered, and then they leave, and you're like, all right, back to square one.
But I've often used an analogy with my team because I think it's really helpful. Of like, maybe it's because of my age too, though. Like bobbing for apples, we don't bob for apples anymore. But if you kind of go with me in the image, like you've got a water, it's like a water with like in a barrel, and there's apples there, and if the barrel is full of apples, the apples just kind of float where they are. But when you remove one, they all start to drift. And so that can be a negative if you think about it in terms of like, as a leader, when I step out, things start to move, things start to shift. And that's why I talk about like the space I occupy, like as a leader in my 50s, having 20 plus years on my team, I occupy a space. And when I'm there, everything's very stable. When I'm removed, things start to shift. But in the same way, like when you talked about Adam, Lucas, Jordan, and Amy, who were all on our staff, when they were removed, all of a sudden the drift starts to bring to the surface other people that like we would have overlooked. And so it's meant opportunity for new staff, for those who were like high level volunteers to make it onto staff. It's crazy. So the way that we've started to look at it is like, we don't need a great team on the court. We don't need just a great team on the court and a great bench. We need a great team on the court. We need a great bench, and we need a farm team.
Yeah.
And so that's really the analogy we're working with now is like, where are we developing the farm team? We need to be 3 steps back in leaders development so that as the Lord leads people on and out, that we're just excited about, this is your moment. This is your time. So right now our apprenticeships are kind of like our farm team, and our new Ascend program, which is like a gap year program, our college, that is becoming our farm team. And kids ministry is a farm team for some because they're going to move into something else. Youth ministry can be a farm team for some. In what I'm saying, that like in terms of senior leadership or church planting or whatever. But I think we got to look way deeper than that, because I felt I could do youth ministry forever. That's how I felt. And I don't think it's fair to devalue that long-term youth pastor by saying, someday, so I don't do that. Now we're just looking at it sort of across the board. Like, who is it that's coming up? Who is it that we need to be investing in? And so that's become our language. Like, where's the farm team?
So you moved to Victoria and you're with Youth for Christ and then with Coastline Church.
Yeah.
And your journey at Coastline in terms of ministry was also paralleled with a pretty profound journey in your personal life.
Yes.
And just to whatever degree you're comfortable, I'd love to hear a bit more about that, because I think one of the unique things, this is true of any profession, but I know for the pastors listening, it would be so great if our lives were stable and consistent while we do ministry, which is constantly feels like a volatile environment. And but when you are going through highs and lows in your personal life, so affects the way you can show up to minister for others.
Oh, totally.
And in some cases it can almost feel impossible to navigate both. And I've learned a lot from you of what that looks like to navigate that with open hands and humility before God and others. So just to whatever degree you're comfortable sharing a bit about your own personal journey that was happening alongside your 20-year story with Coastline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my wife, Lisa and I are really comfortable sharing because of the beautiful healing that the Lord's done in our lives, and when the Lord heals you, he also restores your joy, even to be able to look at those scars and to say, those have meaning and purpose in the strength and the joy that the Lord provides in the midst of difficulty. So yeah, I would just say for leaders out there, let the Lord heal you. Don't bleed on people, right? But when you're well, when you're healed, let the Lord use your testimony. So I use it, but I also use it carefully because it's not just my story.
Yeah.
It's my children's story. It's my church's story. And so I want to honor all of them in whatever I say, because our older two children have had to live that story. And so we're a blended family. Lisa and I I think we've been married 16 years. And we're a blended family. So when we got married, I had a 7-year-old and she had a 5-year-old. So, but I'm jumping ahead. So I'll go back just a bit. So yeah, when I came to Canada with my first wife, the goal was to repair and restore and move forward in ministry. And so I did Youth for Christ, and then I joined the staff at Glad Tidings, which became Coastline, and was in youth ministry for several years. And about 5 to 7 years into that journey, my first wife had another affair, and that was sordid and long, and with another staff member that's at Glad Tidings, which is the church I now pastor, which is part of the miracle. But I had to walk through some really deep waters, some deep pain. And there were times where, I just felt like, God, what's happening here? What actually is there anything left? And my marriage dissolved, and I was a single dad with a 3-year-old little girl, and just trying to figure out how to do life as a pastor. And you start to hear all of the kind of the comments, the just the way we talk in church. We're so family centric. You start to hear it differently. When you're maybe on the more broken side of that storyline, and how do I feel included? How do I, my child's going back and forth. How do I figure this out? Yeah. And also I'm one of the pastors. And so it was a really unique time, a really unique learning experience for me. Yeah.
How did you, this might feel like a strange question, but what were some of the lies that you had to sort of confront in those years? Like, I just see I guess I'm thinking about like how, whether it's just how the enemy wants to use any narrative, spin it back at us, our own failures, our own brokenness, ways we've been hurt. I assume if there's a real enemy, which we believe there is, one of his main goals would be to derail people from effective ministry.
Totally.
And I just think about when there is deep wounding and betrayal, how that can leave you so susceptible to, I'm just curious, what were some of those lies in those years of ministry that you had to sort of, with the support of others and thoughtful, prayerful engagement, sort of say, I'm not going to live into that?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really great question. I think there's personal application there, but also then ministry stuff as well. So, when Lisa and I teach on, marriage, which we do, and when we, get the opportunity to share, we use like Avery labels, because there were throughout the journey just different labels that you just felt like, the enemy just put that
right
there.
Yeah.
And it's like, boom, now you have that. This pain equals this.
Yeah.
And so we feel like we were always at different stages tearing off these labels, if you will, that the enemy had put there. And there are things like, of course, like shame.
Yeah.
Like even a simple question like, hey, how did you get to Canada from the US can actually be attached to a deep shame because it's like, that now I have to tell you my broken story. Now I have to show you those tender places, right? And so it's like the kind of conversation you have, at a bus stop or a coffee shop or a first meeting of a stranger when you're getting introduced, and then they ask you that question, and it's like, so how do I pivot from this question, or how do I squirm out of it? So you're always confronted, I think, with shame. I think there's a sense, in my case, it was like abandonment. It was also a sense of I'm unlovable. So these personal labels that really came, that were like, there's something wrong with me. I'm deficient somehow. You feel stupid. Like this was, there was an affair, then there was a desire for recovery, then another affair. And you're like, why am I so stupid? Why could I not see what others saw? And so you start to play these scenarios in your head that really affect your own confidence. And so I would say that as a result, like the way I described it is, it's sort of like you just feel like you're always going to walk with a limp. You're always going to have a scar. And in some ways you feel like that wants to define you. So that's on the personal side. I would say on the ministry side, I wasn't sure I was going to make it through in my calling. I'm like, what does this mean for me as a pastor? This kind of brokenness, the hurt that I've had to see in the eyes of people who God called me to pastor now, because they're trying to process what happened as well, right? And you're thinking, man, am I still going to be effective? Am I still going to be able to be useful? So yeah, maybe it was like a sense of like my calling is at stake, and so I had to work through all of those lies. I remember one time Ron, he was so good, like so patient, so available. And he's like, I'm going to walk with you, Andy, as long as I can. And we both agreed we didn't know what this was going to look like. At some point it might be like, I think this is where the road ends. But he's like, I'm going to walk with you as long as I can.
Wow.
And I just remember one day, it was a Sunday actually. And I was supposed to do the announcements. And I'm downstairs in my office and I just am a mess.
And in the timeline, how many months has there been? Because this isn't 2 weeks after.
No. This is like, this would be 4 or 5 months later.
Yeah. And just, did you take some intentional time? So you geared down in terms of ministry output and things? Yeah, I
did. Yeah, that's a whole timeline in itself, right? Like I went to counseling every month for 2 years. I like literally walked with my counselor, who was amazing. And he was also a pastor. So he just got it. And I was like, tell me if I'm crazy. Like, am I crazy? Is this wrong? Am I, this is what I think. This is what I feel. And so I walked with him. He was brilliant. He was God's gift to me.
Wow.
And so for 2 years, I was in counseling like every month. Like I didn't miss a month. I needed it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so 5 months into that journey.
Yeah, I'm not preaching at this point.
You're on Sunday and you're supposed to do announcements. And what happens? Just
announcements. Like it's just like, hey, everybody, check your bulletin. We had a bulletin back then.
Come on, let's go.
Check your bulletin. And I just fell apart. So one of the things I learned is that you don't get to control when the emotions come. Right. And you can stuff them, but you're only causing yourself pain if you do that. It's like your body goes through the process of grief in a way that it feels ready to now express that grief. You can't force it. So I always am careful with people like, listen, if people say, I haven't cried yet. I just haven't cried. I'm like, you will.
Yeah.
You will. And so this was a very inconvenient moment to cry. And I was a total mess. I called up to the office to Ron's assistant and I was like, can you please tell Ron I don't feel well? And I'm not going to be able to come up. And he came down and he sat with me and he's like, you can go home. It's fine. And he put his hand on my shoulder. I'll never forget it, Jason. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, Andy, you'll always have a ministry because you have a calling. Mm. And it was like it broke one of those lies off. Wow. That was like, it's done. I'm like on borrowed time. This is it, And so when I heard him say that, I held on to that. That was like, he may not even remember it. I remembered it most days.
Wow.
That's how significant his words were to me in that moment. That's why I honor him. That's why I love him. That's why he's on our staff still, because he's just that kind of a man. To me, he's my pastor. Mm-hmm. But it was in that moment where I just felt like, I think regardless of what this ends up looking like, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be all right. But I did go home and I did cry the rest of the day, and I just stayed home. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah. Like I said, when it's a healed place and the Lord has done so much, I mean, my goodness, this is the hard part of the story, but like pain's a great substitute teacher. Like when pain comes into your life, you're just like, man, I'm learning. I don't want to learn these lessons. I didn't ask for it, but I'm learning. But Jason, what God has done, like in his faithfulness and in his timing and his compassion and just the way that he's blessed my life and my family and my children, it's unbelievable. It's redemption. It's like I've got to walk a redemption path, and it's amazing.
It's been special for me to hear secondhand of pastors who I love who've been able to spend time with you and a quiet ministry in your life to encourage those who are feeling in the aftermath where everything's exploded.
Yeah.
And just to the way you can enter in. And I think one of the challenges is like the possibility of restoration sometimes feels like it's not even in a category in our imagination when you're in the midst of brokenness. To experience the care of somebody who knows what it feels like, but then to also open a crack of like hope. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've been able to do that firsthand for people, and I'm so grateful for that.
Oh, thank you. I just want to take what God has given me and hold him up with it. Like, look what God does. And I think people just need hope. I mean, there's probably pastors listening to us or individuals who are wondering what their future looks like. And I'm just so confident to be able to say, if you're still breathing, God isn't done. He's not done. The story is still being written, and you feel like it might be at the end of the chapter or the end of the book. It's not, because he's writing. He's writing. And so, just keep your heart soft, stay optimistic, just believe, like let faith find a place in your heart. And I started to rehearse that. That was part of the recovery. It was like, you know what? God's not done yet.
Wow.
God's not done yet. I feel done, but that doesn't mean he is. That to me was really helpful.
I'd love to chat a little bit about Coastline. You guys just celebrated your 101st birthday.
That's right.
That's wild.
It's not a church I planted.
You didn't plant a church. That would be, what's the longest tenured pastor in Canada? I want to know that. If anyone listening knows the longest tenured pastor, I'd love to give an award out or something like that through the pastorate.
Yeah, hey.
101 years old. Tell us a little bit about the story. Like I just love, I think you and I should I love the local church.
Yeah.
When I go on road trips and I see a church, I just like, what's happening in that church? Who's pastoring that church? When did that church start? Like, totally. It's just like, I want, like that's, and so when I hear 101 years and maybe you can even just start by painting the picture, like it's right, like in the heart of downtown or like close to, it's an urban church. It's just incredible. Tell us a bit about the story. And I mean, what's crazy is how much Victoria's changed in 100 years. And so it's like, you've got this church in this city that would have been such a different city, obviously 10 different cities in 100 years.
Yeah.
But just bring us into the story. I want to hear a bit about it.
It's a great church. I mean, obviously it's my heart. Like I love our church. And the story of our church is rich, right? So like our roots are revival roots. There was one significant move of God in British Columbia that really is where our church began. It was
Tell us about that.
most significant move of God that we've experienced on the west coast of Canada.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was like 1923.
Okay.
Charles Price was a American preacher who came north, kind of came up through across like Idaho, Washington, and then up into BC. He had revival meetings in Vancouver that were really powerful. I have his memoirs. But when he came to Victoria, there was an incredible outpouring. And so some of the things that happened were, signs and wonders, miraculous healings, many, many people
do you know what brought him to the island at that point?
Yeah. The ministerial invited him.
Wow. So there was a number of churches.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what the population of the region would have been at the time.
I don't remember either.
And so they wrote him a letter.
Yeah.
Said, would you come? And he comes.
Yeah. One of the ministerial had been in the States and heard him preach and saw those revival meetings and said, we need this in Victoria. Came back and appealed to the ministerial who invited him. Wow. And so he agreed and they met at the Metropolitan Methodist Church at that time. It's no longer a church. It's now like a music center and a concert hall and that sort of thing. But at that time it was a church. And there was one of the pastors who had this huge goiter, was prayed for, and it was gone. It was literally gone as they prayed, and legs, extended, and deaf ears opened, and beautiful, beautiful, powerful healings.
Wow.
And then a sort of a great revival of spiritual life and energy in the city. So much so that the newspaper clippings that we have were reporting like people singing hymns on the streetcars in the city. And, just over and over again, the headlines were miracles, wonders, unexplainable. And Charles Price actually at one time was arrested for practicing medicine without a license because of these healings.
Wow. I've never heard that before. Yeah, that's wild.
He's like, no, I honestly, I'm not practicing medicine. I'm just praying and people are getting healed. So out of that kind of significant move, people started to meet and they just said, we're hungry for God. And it really, lined up in a time where Pentecostal churches were forming and thriving, and there was sort of the Azusa Street.
What year is the Azusa Street?
It was like 1905.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's beginning.
Right.
The wave is still growing up. Yeah.
And it was blowing across Canada for sure.
Yes.
And then there was this incredible West Coast thing. And when he came back, like in 1924, there was a lot more of that sense of like he had kind of drilled down on his theological position, which was actually hard for some of the pastors who had him there because they carried a different theological position. Before, in 23, it was all experiential. In 24, it was more like, this is why. And people were a bit resistant. And that actually was a big shift for Charles Price because he was going to move his base of operations to Victoria because of how powerful that move was. And then in 1924, it was kind of he stepped back and never came to Victoria, but people who were touched in that revival began to meet and cry out to God. And our church was formed out of that.
Wow.
Kind of our early days up above the fish and chips shop with the rats running around the floor. And it was an old building, and Smith Wigglesworth, I don't know if you know that name, but he preached in our church.
No way.
And did healing meetings way back. And so that was kind of
Who was the first full-time minister there? Do you know the name?
No, I don't, because it was actually a lot of women who were prominent in those early 20s, 30s. But then I'm not sure if you're familiar with the name C.M. Ward.
No.
But C.M. Ward eventually left. He came to Canada only for a short time, went to the U.S. and was sort of part of the Assemblies of God, and
Yeah.
did a radio show called Revival Time, which was like a kind of a big deal in the U.S. And so C.M. Ward was one of our pastors, but it was really in the 40s when things started to solidify. It's when we opened our Bible college, started sending missionaries, really started to train people, bought the property that we're currently in. And so that's sort of the older story. And then as time marched on in the 70s, there was an expansion, and there were a lot of little outposts, like Sunday schools, they would call them, but it was kind of like campus planting, really.
Yeah.
And they had,
I love that in the Brethren movement was similar. Like they would often, when they go to plant a new gospel hall or whatever chapel, it would be a Sunday school sometimes.
Okay.
Like one of the churches in Vancouver that we're close with, it was a number of them actually started with Sunday school. CLA in Langley, Christian Life Assembly. It was a Sunday school ministry
There you go.
in Langley, which was not a populous city at the time.
Totally.
It was farmland, but now it's growing by tens of thousands a year.
Right.
And women caring for children.
Yeah.
Pioneering. I just love it. It's such a cool part of the story.
Right. That's exactly our story. Yeah. And then when we got sort of into the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was some real intentional church planting. So several churches, even in our city, up the island, as far away as Winnipeg, works were planted as a result of what happened there.
What's so cool is hearing how so much of where God has given you grace today to lead is hidden in your story. My friend Pete Hughes, who's been on the podcast before, I don't think he would coin this line. He got it from somewhere, but he's who I've heard this from. He says, often our destiny is hidden in our history.
So good.
And one of the ways to lead a church, I think this is strategic, into change is to do the deep work in your story. And because, you have generations in an older church, you came in succeeding a pastor who people had trust. How do you lead people into a new initiative if you can find precedence in your story? Not only is you get to see where God's been writing a consistent story, but it also creates like precedence and trust. It's like, oh, we have done sites before. We have pioneered new work. We have sent people. We have invested radically in training up ministers.
Exactly.
And so this is not an Andy idea.
No.
This is hidden in the heart of Coastline / Glad Tidings, and it's what God's been doing.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because I think any pastor who comes in and divorces themselves of the history is not helping themselves, because they're trying to write a story with a group of people that are being denied their identity. And so I do think it's really important that you do the hard work. In some places it is hard work, because maybe pastors are coming in to rebuild something that's really had sort of a season of pain or brokenness of its own. But you're right. I really think that the reason why we've been able to get traction the way we have is because I'm telling the story that's 100 years long of who we are and why we exist, right? And so, so we're returning to our roots, even in like Coastline College. That's part of our roots. We built a college in the 40s that became Summit Pacific College.
Really?
So
was it here before? Was it on the island and then it moved over?
Yeah, it started in our building.
No way.
Yeah. E.A. Robinson was the pastor, and
that's cool.
Or E.W. Robinson was his name, actually. And he was the pastor during that time and started Western Pentecostal Bible College. It was a Bible Institute, and then it became a college, and then it changed its name to Summit. But so that has its roots in our church. So it's like, man, we're just digging up old wells. Yeah. We're drinking water out of these old wells. There's richness there. It's beautiful. And so even the multiplication strategy, the training of leaders, sort of the localized lifting up, and not only just training, but also affirming and being able to say to them, listen, you've been trained locally. We'll also validate you locally, and we'll send you locally. That's really in our roots. Really is. It's in our DNA.
You have a vitality about you in ministry, and you've got real years under your belt serving in one place, which is unique. What advice would you give young ministers who want to go the distance with vitality, joy, faithfulness, integrity, courage?
Yeah, I think I've found a new appreciation for leaning into Paul's writings to Timothy. It's funny as I get older, which I think is quite funny, because Paul spent a lot of time encouraging Timothy because he knew where he was hard.
Yeah.
And so I would say to any leader who's, in the local church over the long haul, just get acquainted with Paul's writings to Timothy, because he really encourages you to hold on, to stay in there. I mean, like Timothy's in Ephesus, that was hard. It was a huge metropolitan area. It was a place of pagan worship. It was incredibly diverse. And so here's young Timothy trying to lead. And so Paul encourages Timothy with 3 metaphors that have really shaped the way that I approach ministry. And he says to him, hey, listen, you need to think about yourself as a soldier. Like, be a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Join me in suffering as a soldier, right? And then he says, hey, remember that athletes, when they compete, they have to compete according to the rules. And then he goes on and he says to them, the farmer is the first one to receive the harvest. And then he says to him, think about these things because God's going to give you revelation about them.
Wow.
And so I have actually spent quite a bit of time just mining out that idea that I'm a soldier, that I'm an athlete, and that I'm a farmer. And when you think about those 3 sort of focal points in terms of identity, they actually create for you a path, I think, to be, resolved, to stay in the fight, to be, like an athlete wants to compete, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then, man, what does a farmer need? Well, hard work and patience.
Yeah.
You're waiting for the harvest. So I think if you see those 3 metaphors, and you mine that out, like Paul encouraged Timothy, I think you'd find a really rich path to long-term ministry, to longevity in ministry. So for me, I always kind of remind myself of those 3 things. Hey, Andy, don't forget, this is one of those soldier moments, just hold the ground, right? Just hold the line. Or this is one of those athlete moments, you need to want to get in this, this competition against your enemy, which of course is not any other church. Yeah. Right. But there is an enemy, and I have to want to be in the battle. Right. And then of course, just what I'm planting today doesn't come up tomorrow.
Right.
But it does come up.
I mean, that's the amazing thing is I'm 20 years deep in ministry. And, I think some of the best fruit in the kingdom of God plays out over 100 years. But there's something that happens after a decade or 2 where you go, whoa, look what God has done with those feeble seeds or that clumsy attempt. And you go, I can't help but just have a expansive imagination of what's possible in decades with what God can do with it. And then, but it is like a perspective change. We're so addicted to short-term results. And God's so much more patient. Sometimes writing stories over generations. Yeah, right. Or even his redemptive timeline is sometimes a lot longer than we want.
Totally. And we're just a part of it, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. We're just going to carry the ball from here to here, right? That's it. In the timeline of Christendom and what God is doing. And even in the life of my church, I didn't start it, and God willing, I won't kill it.
You won't end it. I didn't start this church, but I did end this church. No. Yeah.
God help me. No. And so because of that, it's man, I want to be faithful in this. Yeah. I do. I want to be faithful in this. And I always, what's funny is I always wanted to be a church planter. And I thought at some point the Lord would let me do that. And for whatever reason, in his providence and his call in my life, he said, no, you're not going to be a church planter, but you're going to help churches be planted. Wow. And you're going to send, campus leaders, and you're going to help fund church planters that are going to do that. And maybe there would have been some resistance in that at some point in my life, but man, it's pure joy now. It is pure joy.
Well, it's been such a gift to be with you, brother. Thanks for making time, opening your home to me and the team to be here, and for sharing your story. I love you a ton, respect you a ton, and grateful that you spend this time with us.
Thanks, Jason. Good to be here.